Imagine you are a young boy, no older than 8, playing outside in your small Christian village somewhere in the Balkans. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats shakes the earth beneath you. Ottoman soldiers ride into town, but they aren't here for taxes, or grain, or even your father. They are here for you. Within moments, you are torn from your mother's arms, your cries swallowed by the sound of chains and orders barked in a language you don't understand. You will never see your family again. What awaits you is not simply slavery, it is something far darker. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire cloaked itself in the glory of conquest, dazzling mosques, and powerful sultans. But behind the shining domes and golden palaces, they practiced sexual rituals so terrifying, so methodically organized, that even seasoned historians hesitate to recount them. Tonight, we uncover that hidden world, when we peel back the grand narrative of Ottoman power and glory. The very first practice that stands like a gaping wound in human history is the devshirme system, often known as the blood tax. This was not a minor episode, not an isolated cultural custom misunderstood by outsiders, but a carefully designed institution that operated for centuries and altered the very lives of millions. Imagine entire Christian villages scattered across the Balkans, living in perpetual fear not of foreign invaders or famine, but of the moment when Ottoman officials would descend like hawks, demanding their quota of children. The word collecting became a nightmare term whispered from parent to parent, for the Ottomans did not arrive to gather grain or tribute, they arrived to strip families of their sons. It was the most intimate theft imaginable, the theft of a child from the arms of his mother, the tearing away of identity and the transformation of innocent life into state property. The process was chillingly efficient, more akin to livestock management than human governance. Ottoman administrators carried meticulous registers of every Christian village, noting how many families lived there, how many sons were of the appropriate age, and when that region had last paid its human levy. They did not come blindly. They came with records, orders, and the cold arithmetic of empire. The families knew resistance was futile. To resist meant punishment that could fall upon the entire community, and so mothers often mutilated their own sons, scarring their faces, breaking their teeth, or even crippling their limbs, in desperate attempts to make them undesirable to the collectors. Yet even these heartbreaking acts of self-harm rarely worked, for the Ottomans wanted the strongest, the healthiest, and above all, the most beautiful boys. These were not random kidnappings, but selections performed with the precision of a grotesque market. The boys chosen were typically between the ages of 7 and 14, though the records show children as young as 4 being seized. Each child was inspected as though he were an animal to be trained or a horse to be purchased. Their muscles, their height, their eyes and teeth were all examined. The officials looked for signs of intelligence, docility, and above all, physical beauty. For the most attractive boys were destined not for ordinary servitude, but for the palace itself, where their innocence would be consumed in rituals of power that no child could comprehend. Once selected, they were ripped away immediately, forbidden to speak their native tongue, forbidden even to utter their birth names. Within weeks, they became strangers to themselves, their past beaten out of them, until even memory became a forbidden act. The empire sought not merely their service, but their very souls. Those who survived the initial trauma were filtered into one of 2 paths. Some were sent to the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military machine, where they would be trained as celibate soldiers utterly devoted to the Sultan. Their only family was the barracks, their only intimacy found in bonds with one another that the state itself monitored and manipulated. Others, however, particularly the most physically striking boys, were not so fortunate. They were groomed for the palace, where they would serve in the Sultan's household, often in ways that blurred the line between servant, slave, and victim. Conversion to Islam was mandatory. Their birth fates were ridiculed, their families denounced as infidels, and their old identities systematically erased. To the empire, these children were blank slates, canvases upon which a new identity could be written, an identity useful to the Ottoman state. What makes this system particularly horrifying is not only the brutality of the physical separation, but the psychological reconstruction that followed. The boys were deliberately scattered far from their regions of origin, ensuring that escape was nearly impossible. A child from a Serbian village might find himself surrounded by Turkish, Persian, or Arabic speakers, utterly unable to communicate, his own language becoming a dead relic within his mind. New names were forced upon them, often names meant to mock or obliterate their heritage. They were told their families were damned, that their old faith was a lie, and that loyalty to the Sultan was the only salvation. In a matter of months, the boy who once laughed and played in a Balkan meadow became an instrument of imperial power, trained to kill, to serve, or to submit. And yet the cycle did not end there. The greatest cruelty of the Devshirme system lay in how victims were turned into participants. Those who survived long enough to grow into adulthood often became the very men sent back to their native regions to select the next generation of children. Imagine the torment, a man who had once been torn from his own village, now returning in Ottoman uniform, pointing out which boys would be taken next. In this way, the empire perfected a machine of trauma that fed upon itself, generation after generation, creating victims who became perpetrators, perpetuating the system indefinitely. The blood tax was not simply about gathering manpower. It was about reshaping entire populations, cutting the roots of cultural memory and replacing them with imperial loyalty. The Ottomans recorded all of this with bureaucratic detachment. Ledgers survive that show lists of boys taken, the villages they came from, and the purposes they were destined for. These were not shameful secrets whispered in dark corners. These were official records filed alongside tax documents and military orders. To the Ottoman system, the taking of children was as natural as collecting revenue. But behind each entry in those ledgers was a family shattered, a mother left screaming into the void, a community robbed of its future. The empire reduced human life to numbers, the laughter of children to mere inventory. Historians who examine these records often speak of the silence they carry, the silence of missing voices, the silence of boys who never grew up in their own homes, who never became fathers in their own villages, who never returned to speak their mother tongue again. It is this silence that echoes across the centuries, a silence louder than any Ottoman triumph or architectural wonder. For while the domes of Istanbul still gleam and the mosques still stand, the voices of the stolen children are gone forever, swallowed by the machinery of empire. And it is in that silence that we find the true terror of the Devshirme system, a ritual of power that consumed not only bodies but souls, feeding an empire with the broken lives of its youngest subjects. Among the darkest realities of the Ottoman world lies the ritualized creation of eunuchs, a practice so brutal that it defies comprehension even in an age already saturated with cruelty. For the Ottomans, control over sexuality was not merely a byproduct of empire, but one of its central pillars, and nowhere was this more evident than in the systematic mutilation of boys to manufacture obedience. The empire needed men who could be trusted around the sultan's wives and concubines, servants who could never threaten dynastic purity, and guardians whose entire existence revolved around unquestioning loyalty to the court. To create such beings, the Ottomans relied on one of the most horrifying systems in history: industrialized castration. These children were not mutilated because of crime or punishment, but because the empire demanded bodies that could be reshaped to fit its political machinery, regardless of how many lives were destroyed in the process. The operations were typically carried out far from the imperial capital, in places like Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, where the prohibitions of Islamic law against castration could be circumvented by outsourcing the act to Christians and Jews. This convenient loophole allowed the Ottomans to maintain their religious facade while overseeing a trade that left mountains of corpses in its wake. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical records and contemporary observers suggest that only 10% of boys subjected to the procedure survived. To produce one functioning eunuch, 9 children had to die in agony, their blood spilled not for medicine, not for survival, but for the Sultan's household economy. It was a mathematics of horror, where the suffering of hundreds was considered a reasonable price for the manufacture of a few survivors. Entire caravans of boys were led into these makeshift operating centers, but only a fraction ever emerged alive, and those who did were forever altered in body and soul. The procedure itself was a mutilation of the most intimate kind. For African boys, the practice was particularly severe, involving the removal of the entire genitalia, transforming them into what the Ottomans called black eunuchs. These mutilated children were considered more reliable around the Sultan's harem, since they were thought incapable of temptation or betrayal, their very humanity amputated in the name of palace security. European boys from the Balkans endured a slightly different fate, usually the removal of their testicles alone, producing white eunuchs who often served as administrators, clerks, or attendants in the more bureaucratic arms of empire. Yet regardless of origin, the violence was absolute. To be castrated was to be stripped not only of reproductive potential, but of social belonging, severed from the possibility of family, love, or any semblance of normal human intimacy. The empire elevated these survivors into positions of significant responsibility, creating a cruel paradox. Eunuchs, robbed of their basic humanity, often became some of the most powerful figures in the palace hierarchy. Black eunuchs, in particular, rose to become the chief guardians of the imperial harem, wielding immense influence over who had access to the sultan's private quarters. In some cases, they became kingmakers, orchestrating palace intrigues, manipulating succession, and commanding vast networks of servants. Yet their authority was always conditioned by their mutilation. They were powerful only because they had been broken, feared only because they had first been made incapable of ever leaving the prison of their role. The empire had constructed a system where power itself became inseparable from trauma, where the path to influence required, first, the sacrifice of one's body and one's future. For the boys themselves, survival was often more curse than blessing. Those who lived carried physical pain for the rest of their lives, infections festering in the aftermath of crude operations, wounds reopening under strain, bodies never fully healing. Beyond the physical suffering was the psychic devastation. These children were told from the moment of their mutilation that they were less than men, less than human, shadows of what they once might have been. They lived in a state of perpetual exile, incapable of marriage, incapable of fatherhood, incapable of returning to the communities from which they had been stolen. Their only identity was that of eunuch, their only purpose to serve the system that had destroyed them. The empire had created not simply servants but living ghosts, reminders that even the most intimate aspects of life could be consumed by the machinery of power. The cruelty extended further, into rituals of humiliation and spectacle. Eunuchs were not merely hidden away in palaces. They were paraded as emblems of the Sultan's authority, proof that he commanded not only the swords of soldiers but the very bodies of children. The sight of black eunuchs at the palace gates or white eunuchs directing administrative chambers was a daily reminder that the empire could reach into the most private realms of existence and reshape them according to its will. In a society where masculinity and lineage were paramount, the deliberate mutilation of boys symbolized the absolute dominance of the state over nature itself. By unmaking men, the Ottomans asserted that nothing was beyond their power, not faith, not family, not even the human body. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was its normalization. Ottoman records list eunuchs with the same detached tone as livestock, reducing the horror to a bureaucratic category. Ledgers note their ages, their origins, their functions within the palace, as though they were furniture or tools. The empire's chroniclers recorded their roles without pity. Diplomats mentioned them without outrage, and even European observers, while disgusted, often treated their existence as little more than a curiosity. This silence around their suffering reveals the terrifying efficiency of the system. It was not seen as aberration, but as tradition, not as barbarity, but as governance. The mutilation of boys had become a ritual of empire, accepted and institutionalized across centuries. When we examine the legacy of this practice, the tragedy deepens. The eunuchs who survived long enough to grow old often died alone, their bodies buried without descendants, their names vanishing without lineage to carry them forward. They were men without sons, fathers without families, human beings stripped of continuity, their bloodlines erased as thoroughly as their bodies had been. In this way, the empire not only destroyed individuals, but erased entire possibilities from history, severing branches from the tree of humanity. The silence of those lost possibilities still echoes today, reminding us that the Ottoman project of control reached far beyond politics or war. It reached into the very biology of its subjects, twisting life itself into an instrument of power. And in that silence lies the most terrifying truth, that an empire once built its foundations on the systematic mutilation of children and considered it a mark of order rather than a crime against nature itself. Behind the gilded latticework of Ottoman palaces, where travelers described domes glistening with gold and fountains murmuring in tranquil courtyards, there existed an institution that reveals the empire's most terrifying transformation of intimacy into industry: the harem. To the Western imagination, the harem has long been romanticized as a place of beauty, luxury, and seduction, filled with jeweled women reclining on cushions. But the historical reality bears little resemblance to this fantasy. The harem was not a paradise, but a prison, a carefully constructed system designed to commodify women's bodies on an industrial scale, to supply the desires of sultans, viziers, and courtiers, and to keep the machinery of imperial power lubricated with sexual exploitation. It was a system in which girls were torn from their families, stripped of their names, and processed like merchandise, their value measured in coins and their fates determined by the cold arithmetic of markets. The empire maintained vast slave markets in cities like Constantinople, Cairo, and Aleppo, where women and girls from across 3 continents were bought and sold as casually as animals. These markets operated with the efficiency of modern corporations, with elaborate pricing systems that categorized human beings according to origin, beauty, age, and sexual desirability. African women were priced differently than European women. Virgins commanded higher rates than those who had been defiled, and the youngest girls, some not yet adolescents, fetched the highest prices of all. The empire's legal codes did not merely permit this trade, they institutionalized it, creating frameworks where the purchase of a female body was no more controversial than the purchase of a horse or a rug. Women were stripped naked before crowds of buyers, prodded and examined for signs of fertility or disease, their tears disregarded as insignificant details in a transaction that reduced them to objects of flesh. From these markets, the most beautiful and promising girls were channeled into training centers known as the schools of the odalisques. Here, they were forcibly molded into instruments of pleasure, taught the arts of seduction, song, and dance, instructed in how to dress, walk, and even breathe in ways that heightened their allure. This was not education but indoctrination, a systematic stripping away of individuality to create perfectly polished commodities. Behind the walls of these schools, broken children were reshaped into luxurious objects for imperial consumption, their former lives buried beneath the demands of performance. By the time they were delivered to the harem, they were not daughters or sisters any longer. They were merchandise, trained to serve, and conditioned to believe their value resided only in their ability to please the men who owned them. Inside the harem, the reality was even more suffocating than the training schools. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women competed for the sultan's attention in a hierarchy deliberately designed to foster jealousy, suspicion, and betrayal. This was no community of sisters, but an arena where rivals were pitted against one another in desperate contests of survival. Women sabotaged each other, whispered lies to palace officials, and endured humiliating tests of loyalty, knowing that failure might mean exile to a brothel or death by strangulation. The palace maintained this atmosphere deliberately, for division prevented solidarity, and suspicion kept the women's attention fixed on one another instead of on the system that enslaved them all. Even small privileges, like access to better clothing or food, were granted or withheld as tools of manipulation, turning every relationship within the harem into a potential weapon. The psychological cruelty was matched by physical violence. Punishments for disobedience could include beatings, starvation, or confinement in dark isolation cells where women languished until their spirits broke. Execution was not uncommon, especially for those accused of disloyalty, witchcraft, or simple disinterest in pleasing the sultan. Records tell of women drowned in weighted sacks and cast into the Bosphorus, their deaths erased without ceremony, their absence explained away as though they had never existed. Those who survived long enough to age out of desirability faced equally grim fates, for the empire had no use for women who could no longer serve as instruments of pleasure. Some were sold back into the markets, others abandoned on the streets, and still others simply killed to make room for younger, more valuable replacements. The harem, despite its silken cushions and perfumed halls, was a factory of disposability. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the system was the treatment of children born within the harem walls. In theory, a concubine who bore a son could rise in status, for her child might one day become a prince. But this opportunity was fraught with danger. Rival concubines plotted against each other, poisoning infants, strangling newborns, or bribing eunuchs to dispose of children before they became threats to their own offspring's advancement. The empire itself encouraged such practices, for it considered fratricide and infanticide legitimate tools of dynastic stability. Daughters, on the other hand, were often of little value, sometimes discarded outright, sometimes absorbed into the same cycle of commodification that had consumed their mothers. The harem was not merely a prison for women, it was a graveyard for generations of children who were never permitted to live beyond their role as pawns in the empire's sexual and political game. The economics of this exploitation reveal its scale. The trade in women was not incidental to the empire's functioning but central to it. Revenues from the sale and purchase of concubines and domestic slaves funded military campaigns, sustained the lavish lifestyle of the sultan, and cemented alliances with provincial governors and foreign envoys who were gifted women as tokens of imperial favor. Entire wars were waged with the expectation of female captives as spoils, campaigns planned not only for territorial conquest but for the harvest of human bodies. The harem system, therefore, was not an indulgence but a structural necessity, a vast and brutal engine that consumed women as raw material and produced pleasure, loyalty, and profit for the empire. What makes this chapter of Ottoman history particularly terrifying is not only the cruelty, but its normalization. Foreign ambassadors who visited Constantinople often wrote detailed reports of the harem, describing its hierarchies and practices with fascination rather than outrage. For many, the sight of women reduced to property was not shocking but expected, framed as a cultural difference rather than a moral crime. This global complicity allowed the system to persist for centuries, its victims silenced by distance, their suffering hidden behind gilded walls. Yet the legacy remains, not only in the records that describe the systematic buying and selling of women, but in the countless forgotten lives extinguished by a machinery that treated the most intimate dimensions of humanity as resources to be exploited. In the end, the Ottoman harem was less a sanctuary of beauty than a mechanism of power, where women were consumed as instruments of pleasure, rivalry was cultivated as a tool of control, and children were sacrificed as collateral in the empire's endless pursuit of stability. Behind the silks and jewels was a world of blood and tears, where every smile was manufactured, every gesture rehearsed, and every life commodified until nothing remained but obedience. It is here, in the suffocating silence of the harem, that we glimpse the true scale of the empire's terror, the systematic destruction of womanhood, motherhood, and humanity itself in the name of imperial survival. The Ottoman Empire's appetite for control over human sexuality did not confine itself to the secrecy of palaces or the hidden machinery of harems. It extended into the very heart of public life, transforming punishment into performance, humiliation into theater, and human agony into entertainment for the masses. To understand this is to realize that sexual violence was not merely tolerated or hidden within the empire's private spaces. It was staged openly, ritualized, and woven into the culture of justice itself. Public executions in Ottoman cities became carnivals of cruelty, where thousands gathered, not in solemnity or mourning, but in eager anticipation of spectacles that mirrored the crimes for which the condemned had been accused. The line between punishment and pornography blurred as the empire normalized a system where the destruction of human dignity was consumed as a collective amusement. The empire's legal codes reveal how deeply ingrained this system had become. Crimes of a sexual nature, adultery, sodomy, rape, were not addressed with private sentences or quiet punishments, but with elaborate rituals designed to maximize humiliation. Those accused of adultery might be stripped naked and paraded before jeering crowds, subjected to beatings and stoning that reduced their final moments to grotesque displays of suffering. Men accused of homosexual acts could be impaled, their bodies lifted high on poles so that entire communities could watch as they writhed in prolonged agony, their sexual identities destroyed in death as they had been condemned in life. Women accused of promiscuity or disobedience could be bound, their hair ripped out, and their bodies exposed to the violence of mobs who treated their degradation as both entertainment and moral instruction. In these punishments, the empire transformed private intimacy into public annihilation, teaching its subjects that sexuality belonged not to individuals but to the state. Archaeological evidence from execution grounds confirms the extent of this ritualized cruelty. Excavations reveal skeletal remains bearing signs of mutilation far beyond what would have been necessary to kill, suggesting that victims were deliberately tortured in ways that targeted their sexual identity. Bones marked with repeated incisions, pelvises shattered by blunt instruments, skulls scarred from blunt trauma. All these remnants point to executions staged not for efficiency but for spectacle, designed to prolong suffering and satisfy the voyeuristic hunger of crowds. Historians who study these sites often remark on the terrifying detail with which violence was inflicted, evidence that executioners were trained not simply to kill, but to orchestrate suffering in ways that mirrored the empire's obsession with control over the body. Foreign travelers who witnessed these events often recorded their horror, yet even their accounts betray a fascination with the spectacle. Reports describe crowds shouting suggestions to executioners, wagering bets on how long a victim would survive, or demanding new forms of torment when the condemned showed signs of endurance. Punishment had become sport, and the public arena had become a theater where human lives were extinguished for the amusement of onlookers. Children grew up watching these events, absorbing the lesson that power was expressed through domination, that sexuality was a weapon, and that humiliation was as legitimate a form of punishment as death itself. In this way, the empire cultivated generations conditioned to accept cruelty as ordinary, to conflate justice with degradation, and to view sexual violence not as aberration but as entertainment. Particularly chilling were the punishments reserved for those who defied the sexual boundaries imposed by the empire. Prostitutes could be whipped and branded publicly, their flesh permanently marked as warning to others. Accused rapists were executed in ways that mirrored their alleged crimes, sometimes forced into degrading sexual acts before death, a perverse ritual of humiliation that satisfied the crowd's thirst for both justice and spectacle. Enslaved women who resisted their masters might be stripped and flogged in public squares, their punishment reinforcing not only the master's authority but also the empire's broader assertion that women's bodies were never their own. Even within the brutality of empire, there was an unmistakable logic. The state used sexual violence as a form of pedagogy, teaching its subjects through blood and terror that obedience was survival and disobedience was destruction. This normalization of sexual violence as spectacle carried consequences far beyond the execution grounds. It seeped into the culture, shaping how people understood power, justice, and entertainment. Festivals and public events often carried undertones of sexual humiliation, where jesters mocked victims of the harem or performers reenacted grotesque caricatures of eunuchs and concubines for the amusement of elites. The suffering of women, children, and enslaved men became material for comedy, drama, and song, ensuring that cruelty was not merely tolerated, but celebrated as art. This culture of mockery reinforced the empire's message that human dignity was expendable, that the worth of a body lay only in its utility to the state or its capacity to amuse the masses. The most disturbing dimension of this system was its ability to corrupt the moral imagination of an entire society. When children were raised in an environment where public torture was a festival, when families gathered to watch impalements as though attending theater, when women's humiliation was framed as righteous justice, it created a civilization where empathy atrophied and cruelty flourished. Sexual violence ceased to be recognized as violence at all. It became an expected part of the order of things, woven into the rhythm of urban life. This cultural desensitization ensured the perpetuation of exploitation, for when degradation is normalized, resistance becomes nearly impossible. The spectacle itself became the tool of control, conditioning populations to accept tyranny as ordinary and atrocity as entertainment. In the silence left behind by these spectacles, one can still hear the echo of screams swallowed by crowds, the collective laughter of audiences who mistook cruelty for justice, and the heavy silence of those who dared not object. It is here, in the shadow of public executions, that the Ottoman Empire's most terrifying truth emerges. It was not only the rulers and executioners who perpetuated sexual violence, but entire societies conditioned to see it as natural, necessary, and even enjoyable. When an empire succeeds in transforming atrocity into spectacle, it no longer merely rules the bodies of its subjects, it rules their imaginations, their expectations, and their very understanding of humanity. And in that conquest of the mind, it leaves scars far deeper than those etched into the bones of its victims. Scars that echo across history as reminders of how easily civilization can disguise cruelty as order and humiliation as justice. As the centuries of Ottoman dominance stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa, the physical acts of exploitation gradually gave way to something even more enduring: the psychological and cultural scars that would remain long after the empire itself had collapsed. Unlike the domes of mosques that still gleam in the sun, or the palaces whose walls stand as monuments to imperial grandeur, the most lasting monuments of Ottoman power are invisible, inscribed not in stone but in memory, in silence, and in generational trauma. To speak of the Ottoman Empire's sexual rituals is not simply to recount isolated atrocities of a bygone age. It is to confront the reality of how entire societies can be reshaped through terror, how the most intimate bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, men and women, were systematically broken until entire populations internalized subjugation as their natural state. The families whose children were seized in the Devshirme levy lived under the shadow of perpetual grief. Mothers who had their sons ripped from their arms learned to measure their lives not by seasons or festivals, but by the haunting anniversaries of loss, each year marked by the memory of when the officials came. Fathers carried the shame of helplessness, watching the empire strip away not only their children, but their authority to protect them. Villages lost entire generations of boys, leaving gaps that could never be filled, and even in the rare instances when survivors returned as Ottoman soldiers or officials, they were no longer recognizable, their native tongues forgotten, their loyalty redirected, their faces cold to the families that once raised them. This destruction of generational continuity left wounds that no amount of political liberation could heal, for the empire had not merely conquered land, it had colonized memory itself. Within the harem system, the psychological devastation was equally profound. Women who survived its suffocating hierarchy often emerged not as free individuals, but as hollowed remnants of themselves, their identities reshaped by years of competition, suspicion, and forced intimacy. They carried scars of humiliation and betrayal, having been forced to view every other woman not as a sister in suffering, but as an enemy in a perpetual struggle for survival. Those who bore children knew the agony of seeing them murdered in the name of dynastic security, and those who aged out of desirability were cast aside like broken objects, abandoned to brothels or execution. Even generations later, the stories whispered among descendants of enslaved women carried the weight of that fear, embedding in cultural consciousness the knowledge that intimacy could never be safe, that trust could always be betrayed, and that love itself could be turned into a weapon of domination. The eunuchs, whose bodies bore the most brutal mutilations, lived and died as living symbols of the empire's obsession with control. Many rose to positions of immense influence, but their authority was never their own, always dependent on the empire that had destroyed their manhood. They were paradoxes, figures of power who embodied absolute powerlessness, men without lineage, guardians of harems who could never have families of their own. Their very existence served as a constant reminder that the empire could unmake nature itself, severing identity from biology, rewriting destiny through the knife. When they died, their graves were silent, without descendants to honor them, without families to carry their names, leaving behind only the echo of absence, the legacy of lines extinguished before they could ever begin. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy lies in how these practices reshaped culture and morality itself. Children raised in societies where public executions were festivals and sexual humiliation was a spectacle grew up learning that cruelty was normal, that suffering was entertainment, and that domination was justice. Empathy eroded generation by generation, replaced by a calloused acceptance of violence as part of daily life. This normalization did not vanish when the Ottoman Empire fell. It lingered, shaping attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and power in regions once under its control. Even today, traces of this cultural inheritance can be found in the silences of families who refuse to speak of past suffering, in the distrust that shadows relationships, and in the generational wounds that remind us that trauma never disappears simply because the empire that inflicted it has collapsed. As historians sift through the archives of the Ottoman centuries, they find not only documents of cruelty, but also evidence of how methodical and intentional the empire's practices were. The ledgers of slave markets, the bureaucratic records of castration, the lists of children taken in the levy, all testify to a system that was not chaotic or accidental, but carefully designed, maintained, and normalized. It is this methodical nature that renders the legacy so terrifying, for it demonstrates how human beings, when organized under bureaucratic authority, can transform intimacy, sexuality, and even family into instruments of political machinery. The lesson is not confined to the past. It warns us of what can happen whenever systems of power are permitted to treat human dignity as expendable, whenever the private realm of love and intimacy is surrendered to the cold logic of control. The Ottoman Empire may have been formally abolished in 1922, but its shadow lingers. It lingers in the populations whose bloodlines were severed, in the forgotten songs of enslaved mothers, in the silence of eunuchs who left no descendants, and in the psychological landscapes of communities that still carry the residue of exploitation. It lingers in the archives where the empire's crimes are written with the same meticulous hand that once recorded taxes and military orders, as though the destruction of lives were no more remarkable than the collection of grain. And it lingers most of all in the uncomfortable realization that such systems are not relics of a barbaric past, but warnings of what humanity is capable of repeating if vigilance is not maintained. If you have followed this journey through the hidden corridors of Ottoman power, through the markets where women were sold, the chambers where eunuchs guarded silence, and the squares where public humiliation became entertainment, then you have glimpsed how an empire can build itself not only on conquest and architecture, but on the systematic destruction of human intimacy. This history is not merely a tale of the past, it is a reminder of how fragile civilization truly is, and how quickly dignity can be stripped away when power is allowed to rule unchecked. To honor the forgotten victims, to carry forward the lessons carved into their suffering, we must remember their stories, speak their names, and ensure that silence does not swallow their truth. And if you value the uncovering of such dark and hidden history, if you believe that the suffering of millions should not vanish into oblivion, then I invite you to support this work. Like this video, share it so that others may confront these forgotten realities, and subscribe to the channel to join a community committed to shining light on the shadows of history. For only by remembering can we resist repetition, and only by acknowledging the past can we hope to build a future where no empire dares again to turn the most sacred bonds of human life into weapons of control.